Hello and welcome, everybody. It's my pleasure to moderate today's session titled From Visibility to Impact, Rewiring Climate Action from Urban Children Making Slums Central to Adaptation, Not an Afterthought. My name is Simon Runke. I'm an evaluator at the German Institute for Development Evaluation. I'll be taking your questions through the chat. Feel free to post your questions throughout the presentation. We will get to them in the end. There will be time for a Q&A. But first, let me introduce to you our presenters today. First off, we have Dennis Jobin. He's the Senior Evaluation Specialist at UNICEF and the co-chair of EvalSDG. He was part of the team that did the evaluation we are going to hear about today, together with Paola Perez Nieto. Paola is a implementation staff and policy evaluation consultant with over 20 years of experience supporting governments, UN agencies, and INGOs. She was also involved in this evaluation. And we have this very interesting setup today where we also have the client of this evaluation, here represented by Thomas George, who's the global lead for urban at UNICEF. He will be giving comments to this presentation. So we have this great setup where we get the perspective both from the evaluators as well as the client, which I think is going to be tremendously insightful. I'm very excited to hear what Paola and Dennis have to share. And I think it's going to be a very enriching contribution to this event series of evaluation for climate action as part of our pavilion at COP30. I'm actually joining from Belém right now. I'm not at the COP right now because the internet, unfortunately, is not stable enough at the premises to guarantee that I could moderate from there. But yeah, this is all part of our presence in Belém. So I'm very happy we can make this work in the virtual space. With that, I hand over to Dennis, who will start us off with the presentation.
Thank you, Simon. Let me see how I can share the PowerPoint again. Here, desktop one, share. Et voilà. Everybody see the slide?
Yes, we do.
Okay. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So thank you for coming for this webinar. Just to give you a note of a background, this evaluation was designed and conducted data collection in 2024 with a team of 4 consultants and myself who lead and manage this evaluation. The country we can review the entire set of country program document and annual report of UNICEF country offices, and we zoom in into 4 deep dive, Colombia, Cambodia, India, and Kenya that we visited and spent some time there, and some remote country we further focus like South Africa, Nigeria, Afghanistan, and others. So the report is going to be shared in the reference. We're going to have the detail, but just to give you a background of this evaluation that was completed early 2025. So what is the issue? The issue is look at UNICEF work in urban setting and in slum. So essentially, the key message is that there's a rapid urbanization and the slum growth is outpacing inclusion. There's a greater of inequity that is happening as well. So you have the situation is you have 1 billion people living in slum today in the world. Among these, it's estimated that 350 from 500 million are children that they live in slum, and the trend is really rapidly growing to 2 billion by 2030 and 3 by 2050. So it's really a worry trend and something that we need to pay attention as a development partner. The graphic here, you show a comparison of slum population in some countries from 2010 to 2020. This is part of our report. So, for example, rapid major country like India, plus 20%, Kenya, 40%, having one of the largest slum communities in Africa. Climate disaster are expected to be worse in this population and communities because they lack services. They are often located in places that they are exposed to flood. Drought are more severe. They don't have good quality land. Um, so climate change is really undermining the livelihood and drive migration as well from rural to urban because of lack of job and lack of challenge in the rural. So there's more population moving toward communities, urban center, and creating those slum and informal settlement. So the poorest urban children are by far are in the slum communities, worse than rural, as we found. For example, under five mortality is often 3 times higher in slum versus non-slum children. The cross-country analysis we did, urban poor can lack rural, can lack average of health and services. Millions of urban poor and slum are dying before age of 5, so it's really, really a challenge. Children in slum face compounding risk. There's multi-deprivation of all access to service, education, nutrition, violence, drugs, lack of governance, security. So it's really living in slum. It's increased the risk. It's increased the vulnerability. It's worst case. So if I can just take an example, if you recall during the COVID, um, one of the key guidance from WHO and health organization was social distancing. It's inadequate for slum. You can do social distancing. So we need to rethink the programming and rethink how we do. The urban paradox, the children are at the front line of the climate vulnerability. They have heat wave, they have flood, they have landslide that amplify their deprivation because where they are situated, they are not often not in the best place, quote unquote, of the urban area. Yeah, where they are the less value, if you want, of the city. So it's really having the risk that they face is really the exposure versus the vulnerability that is higher because of the unsafe water, waterborne disease, no sewage or access to latrine, and really sanitation service that are missing. So it's really, really, really challenging. Um, the social cohesion as well is really there's community there that are really affected by the hardship that they experience. So essentially, the climate hazard with the situation where there's no services, there's lack of services, and they are in location that they are risky or not well situated, not safe geographically, and lack of governance, found that they have the worst case, they are the most exposed to climate change, and they are the most vulnerable, the population living in slum and informal settlement, and especially children. That is a concern for us. So for us, we identify that inadequate climate resilience and disaster risk management are core driver for the slum deprivation. Urban programming model emphasis on risk informed approach and local disaster management that will help to better help the city to plan and to reach out to these communities, including potentially with social protection and cash transfer. It's something that we've seen that is working well and that has the potential to work well. So According to UN Habitat, World Cities Report 2024, informal settlement and slum are highly climate vulnerable because of the reason I mentioned, and we should be prioritizing upgrading their condition and providing the service that they need, because these population right now are left behind, and it's really against the principle of no one left behind of the SDG. So I will pass over to my colleague Paola to continue the presentation.
Yes, so I will, hello everybody. Danny, can you move to the next slide, please? I will talk briefly about some examples we saw during the evaluation of good practices of responses to this sort of nexus between climate risk and climate impact and the consequences in urban in slums and informal settlements. Some UNICEF specific examples, but also we saw other actions by NGOs and particularly the importance of working together with local governments to make sure that these responses are in place and are working to reach the population. So in the case of Cambodia, we saw that they're working on a child-centered climate risk map that is very it was actually developed as a result of sort of guidance during that was agreed during COP27 for several countries in Asia, and they came together and developed this climate risk index, but down to the commune level. And something that we observed in our work was that the importance of local level data to be able to address the risk that population, particularly children living in slums, are facing. So this is very relevant because it does the risk analysis at the very local level, commune level, both in rural and urban areas, but then obviously in urban, it picks up several risks that are related to the situation that children living in slums that Denny was referring to, and so this subnational analysis. And so they have been working to implement this this index in some of their communes already, with some focus on the exposure children are facing in urban slums. So it's a promising way to see how they can develop disaster risk reduction strategies and prevention to enable them to respond better to climate shocks in these contexts. If you see the PowerPoint presentation, if we're able to share it with you, you'll see a link to the YouTube video with information, and you can find more details online. So this is a very interesting example of this nexus. Next, we see, we also saw in Kenya, Denny, if you could move to the next slide. We saw in Kenya several responses. I mean, the most recent and very glaring climate shock that was experienced by urban slum populations in particularly in Nairobi, slums like Mathare and Kibera, Mukuru, but particularly in Mathare, was flooding in 2024. There was a severe flooding. You can see in the image, children hugely impacted. And so we saw interesting responses in terms of emergency cash transfers that had flexible modes of implementation and reach to this population that had been displaced. Many of these types of informal housing were swept away by the flooding of the river that crossed through Mutoro. There's open sewers, so huge hygiene and sanitation hazard there. And so there were interventions around improving sanitation. Also, many informal schools that are present in these slums were washed away with the very limited material they had. So UNICEF made some specific interventions to address education needs for these children who had their livelihoods quite changed. So what we recommended in this case, based on what we saw in different countries, is that these emergency responses are very important, but with better specific climate mapping of risk in these slum areas and better prevention mechanisms, responses could be more effective, and there could be more risk reduction and prevention strategies. Next slide, Denny, please. Another example we saw was in Colombia, which was another one of our deep dive countries. And here it was very interesting. They used GIS mapping, satellite mapping to identify how we were talking about how populations are moving from rural areas to urban areas. In the case of Colombia, both due to drought and conditions in rural areas, but also because of conflict, they're moving to these urban centers, and it's a huge growth, and there's a very limited service provision and water and sanitation risks. So they use these maps to be able to identify what the situation was, the growth situation, and how they could better address it through service provision with a focus on WASH, but with a very close dialogue with local authorities, local governments, using this evidence, this data to be able to program better. So very interesting example as well. You can find details of all of these in our evaluation. So that my last slide, which is the next one, just sums up some of the good practice suggestions or lessons learned that we shared in the evaluation. The importance of operationalizing multi-sector area-based programs using localized data. So this is crucial. In the case of slums, aggregate national level data doesn't really do a service to this population. So this is crucial. And then working across sectors, given the multiple risks and vulnerabilities that we talked about earlier. Partner with municipal and local governments and communities is central. Participatory leadership of local organizations. We saw this in several countries where things were working well and had more likelihood of being sustainable. They were working through community participation. Local actors are important, particularly in the context of different type of governance structures locally that need to be informed by the situation on the ground. Importance of making children in slums very visible. Danny talked about this. Target extreme vulnerabilities, issues around disability, female-headed households, migrants who face increased risk. There's a very, Thomas might mention this, but very limited birth registration of children in slums that make them very difficult to reach by services. Engage this local level policy with upstream policy, including social protection and other responses. And then, yes, we'll talk again about strengthening local data and risk mapping. I'll end my time here so that Thomas has a chance also to discuss, and we give a few minutes for questions and answers. Hopefully you'll be able to access the evaluation and let us know if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paola. Thank you also to Dennis. Thomas, before I hand over to you, just a reminder to everybody, feel free to post your questions in the chat also as Thomas now gives his comments so that we can jump right into the Q&A. But for now, I hand over to Thomas. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. And thank you to Denny, Gonzalo, Paolo, Sebastian, and the team for this wonderful evaluation. And since it was a formative evaluation, they were kind enough to engage the client also while doing the evaluation. And that was very useful for us to understand more about the situation and to get things going. From the data which has been presented here, we know, and otherwise also from other data, we know that slums are a different universe within urban and cities. But that is maybe a subject which has not received enough attention from evaluations, from programming, and from advocacy. So I hope that this evaluation will help us in taking it to the next level to show that slums are an integral part of the cities and urban, and we need to focus on them more. From various evidence from this evaluation and other evaluations, we know that climate change is also a driver of urbanization, a key driver of urbanization, and the growth of slums and informal settlements are in many ways influenced by climate change in rural areas, loss of harvest, loss of livelihood, and people flock to the cities and they end up in slums. 70% of cities are already affected by climate change, we know that. And in the cities, people living in slums get affected more because slums are in low-lying areas and in precarious situations. And moreover, Children are also disproportionately affected because of their unique metabolism, physiology, and development needs. And we also know from evidence that children are twice as likely as adults to live in extreme poverty. So encouraged by this slum evaluation results, we were encouraged to dive deeper into the subject of climate, cities, and slums and children. And we now know that floods and heat waves and are probably the two biggest threats for children in most parts of the world. But if I can read out from a paper which we are doing now, it says by 2050, children's exposure to heat waves is projected to increase 8-fold. Already we are seeing the effects of heat wave on children. Imagine it will be 8-fold, to cyclones by 1.2 times, and to river flooding by 3.1 times. You open the newspapers, you will find often cities flooded, urban areas flooded, slums flooded. So how can we make sure that slums and children in slums and people living in slums are the core of disaster risk response planning and management in future? How can we look at data? Urban rural is the conventional disaggregation. Can we look at urban slums, urban non-slums, rural as a disaggregation? Because by 2050, 3 out of 10 people will live in slums, 3 out of 10 people will live in rural areas, and 4 out of 10 people will live in urban non-slums. So can we look at that in future? And I end by bringing this on the table. How can international organizations working on slums like World Bank, UNICEF, UN Habitat, and the evaluation community come together to make this issue more visible for people living in slums and especially for children living in slums? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Dennis, Paola, is there a response or reaction you want to give to these comments? I mean, Thomas raised some questions here. Meanwhile, still the invitation to people to chime in on the chat.
I think I have something also to add from what we were able to see during our field work, that we're talking about all the risks related to climate impact on urban communities, but also looking at the other side in terms of the potential action that children and youth in these slums and informal settlements can take in terms of acting to improve climate, not only in terms of awareness raising, but also in terms of having improved practices. I mean, we saw many of these families live in areas where the trash is just thrown and so we saw many initiatives, community-based initiatives focused on recycling, selling recyclable products. I mean, that's their livelihood, but then in other ways we saw them having direct awareness of the impacts of climate, then being able also to more proactively become actors. So important also to think about how these efforts can be supported on the ground to ensure that they are also contributing to prevention.
If I can add, is there any question? Otherwise, I can add something from the.
Feel free to add, Dennis.
Yeah, from the evaluation, many observations we've made, but one is maybe the need for a paradigm change in the from the development partner. It's amazing to see that we have offices near the slum, but we don't see them. We still need national survey, but we drive through them through the slum community, and they are invisible to us. But you can see them. They are, so you don't need a national survey, and right. So I guess some of the development partners become blind to the issue, and we really need to rethink. And one of the issue, maybe a barrier, is the approach of working with, is the way we are set up and the way government is set up, a Ministry of Education, a Ministry of Social Equity and Women, a Ministry of Health. So we are sectoral approach, but we really need to have a problem-driven approach, a multi-sectoral approach, because slum, it's not a water problem in slum. It's not an education problem. It's all these problems together, and they all interlink. You can solve one, doesn't change anything if you solve one without solving more and having more holistic approach. So it's really to do the same thing but differently, and to rethink our approach. Development partner across the board, UN, FAI, government, NGO, we need to rethink. But there's some promising practice and there's some way forward. Thank you.
Excellent points. I have to say, as an evaluator myself, this your presentation has been very encouraging, seeing like how evaluation can not just evaluate the effectiveness of a particular intervention, but lend visibility what is happening on the ground and how like climate change is actually manifesting in the life of the most vulnerable. We have one question in the chat here that is asking about the aspect of community leadership and participation you guys were referring to, particularly some of the challenges that might be expected on the ground when such awareness is not there. So does either of you want to take up this question?
Yeah, happy to start and then pass over to my colleagues. I think we saw quite a lot of community-based participation, both with women's leadership and with young people's leadership. Some of them had been supported through some local NGOs with technical and financial support from UNICEF and others. And so to mobilize and raise awareness and structure this participation, but many of the initiatives were very much community-led. And so we saw that there's a lot of interest in improving the situation of their communities in which they live through youth itself. We saw things that were happening through art, through restoring green areas around these slums. We saw an image of this flooding in the river, but after the flood, after the flood, we saw how they were developing green areas in sort of the flood basin so that the housing wouldn't go down to that level again. And this was very much led by young people with the support as well of NGOs like Slum Dwellers International, like UN Habitat, so and with local government. So there is a lot of scope for this community-led initiatives. Over to others.
I can come in here if I may. So when we look at the vulnerabilities of children and people living in slums, we can look at it from a three-point lens. One is the household vulnerability. Slums are defined as places where housing is inadequate. One is a neighborhood vulnerability because of, as Denny or Paula said before, with the waste and not proper infrastructure. No? The third one is social vulnerability. There, refugees, migrants. Then there are girls, women, disabled people. Those kind of social vulnerabilities also. Once these three vulnerabilities are overlaid on each other, then there is a multiplier effect. But that doesn't mean to say that there is no hope. We have a program called Green Rising. This program is the aim was to mobilize by 2026 10 million young people for green action, and this has been launched in slums as well, where in slums, along with green action, green skills, employability, livelihoods, and all is a core area for focus. And we're happy to say that the aim was to reach 10 million people. I think already they've reached something like 21 million young people, both in rural and urban. So there is a lot of stuff happening there. Maybe the need is to bring all of this together and make it more visible to the outside world.
Yeah, on the point of visibility, I hope you guys see the chat, because Sabine there is very encouraging of you to share these findings widely, and I can only second that. I think, as I already mentioned, for me as an evaluator, they were very encouraging, but I think generally, I think this visibility that this evaluation and your efforts can lend to this issue are really, really helpful and important. I'm afraid we're already approaching the end of the webinar. There's another question in the chat, but I'm afraid we're not going to have time to get to that regarding the roles of MDBs in addressing institutional fragmentation. But at this point, I can only thank the three of you for this really, really insightful presentation. I really like the setup here of having both the evaluators as well as the client coming in, so we would get the full picture of not just how the evaluation went, but also what it moved on the side of the client. I think it's really a lesson for all of us on what evaluation can achieve and how evidence can promote the livelihoods of the most vulnerable. Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Paola. Thank you, Thomas. And hope to hear from you guys soon.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you to Deval as well for the invitation, and thank you to all panelists as well and attendees.
Thank you, Simon. And just
Simon.
for everybody to know, we are crafting a call to action for a diverse set of stakeholders from this evaluation findings. You will see it soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. All the best.